We are going to do some tracking in After Effects, and we're going to look at what the tracker does. So before we do that, let's look at the Adobe Help page and see what it says about motion tracking. If you look at the first sentence, it says, with motion tracking, you can track the movement of an object and then apply the tracking data for that movement to another object, such as another layer or an effect control point. So we have footage to work with, and then we need another layer to apply the movement to. So first layer, good. Now we're going to make a null object. You can apply it directly to whatever layer you're going to have in here. And like maybe you want to have some text that's following along with the buildings, or you want to have some graphics. Personally, I think it's easiest to work with a null object because then you can parent everything else to the null object. So we're going to start with this video footage layer, and we are going to have a null layer. Now I've already been working here in this project, so that's why it says null 8. When you do this, it'll probably say null 1. So to use the tracker, we'll go up here and we'll click on tracker. If it doesn't show up here on the right hand side, go up to window and find the tracker and then select that. And then sometimes when you open up the tracker, it won't have the whole window visible. So you'll have to pull this down so you can see the rest of the information. You'll see that there are 4 options in here. We have track camera, warp stabilizer, track motion, and stabilize motion. For this tutorial, we're only going to be using the track motion. So I'm going to click track motion. And as you see, when you click on track motion, it loads up the layer. So we're working in the layer view. We're not working in the composition view. All of this tracking is done in the layer view. So we'll go to the layer. As you see, now it has all of this other information. By default, it's just position. This is what we are going to do as a 1-point track. So we're going to leave it on just position for now. And we're going to find a point in here that we want to track. Like maybe we want to track this here. Now I'm going to zoom in so we can see this. This is the tracker. And if we go back to the Adobe page, this is where it gives you information on what these boxes are. The biggest box is the search region. So this is the area that After Effects is going to be looking in for the smaller box, which is the feature region. So After Effects is going to be looking for whatever pattern is inside this smaller box in the area of this larger box. And then this crosshair here is the attach point. So if we go back to After Effects and we look at this, we can see that that's what is happening. This is the pattern that we're telling After Effects to look for. So inside the smaller box. And we're saying, look for this pattern inside of this. So we can back out. And if there is a lot of movement, if the camera is moving really quickly, then you probably want a wider search area. But if it's not moving very fast, then you can have this be small. Problems happen when you have a really small search area, and in the next frame, that pattern leaves the search area. I'm going to select this, and then over here on the side, we're going to analyze forward. And I'm going to back up a little bit so you can see what it's doing. As you can see, it's going frame by frame. I'll stop it and we'll zoom in, and we can look at this. So it's getting information every single frame about where this pattern is. And it's searching again within this area for this specific pattern. And what's nice is that you can actually track forward and backward. So if I had started this track somewhere in the middle or the end here, I could actually go to that point and then have it work backward. I got messed up a little bit there, so I'll just grab this and put it back to where it was, and then you can also go frame by frame, so I could analyze forward, and then it kind of fixed that. So we have tracking data here, and it looks like it was able to lock onto that pretty well. Sometimes you'll get some jitter and you need to try different settings. Let me show you. If we go into the options here, You can do enhance before match, and then the other option that I like quite a bit is this adapt feature on every frame. And what that does is sometimes the perspective will be changing. And as the perspective changes, the reference that it had at the very beginning might not look the same. So adapt feature on every frame helps if you have shifting in perspective. You can also choose whether it's tracking the luminance, which is default, or RGB channels, or the saturation. Usually luminance works pretty well, but if you have something that you know is going to work better tracking in RGB, like if you've shot something on green screen or blue screen and you've set it up to track that way, then you might want to shift over and track using RGB. So these are some other options you can look at that might help. So we have a track. Great, so now what do we do with it? Now we need to tell it where to send this information. Now before we send the information to this layer, I like to move that layer so it's in the same position to start out with. I can jump back over to this menu, and on this tracker I will tell it to send this to null 8, and I'll hit apply. And by default, it wants to send both the X and Y data. So I'll hit OK, and it'll send that. And now as you see, the null object has assumed the same position keyframes as the track. So now if we wanted to put something into this scene, like if we wanted to put some type in here, okay, so I have this graphic in here, and I want this to follow along on this motion. So I need to parent these files. And I have two layers. I have the type layer, and then I have this blue rectangle that's behind it. I'm going to select both of those, and I will parent that to the null object. And you could do that either using the Pickwick, like I just did, or you can go over here to the parent and link, drop down, and choose the layer that you want it to follow. Like this is the null 8. And then now when you play it back, it'll follow along. Now one thing that you will see is that it's not changing in scale or rotating. Now if we look at this layer, we'll see that tracker 1, if we twirl that down, has one track point because this was a 1-point track. We only had position checked, so it only gave us one tracker. So that was track point 1, and that's what we see here. So if we want to include rotation and scale, we're going to make another tracker. So if you want to make another tracker, and when you make another tracker, you don't have to discard your previous track. We can keep this, like this is tracker 1, and we might use that for other things. Or you can send this to other layers, like you don't need to delete this. But to make a new track, you just click again on track motion. And then now you'll see that it says current track, tracker 2. Now for tracker 2, we are going to include rotation and scale. And now as soon as we click those, you'll see we have 2 boxes. Now, I'll just move these on the corners of the roof here. Make the search area a little bit bigger. As you see, I started this like right in the middle of the track, which is not great, but it doesn't really matter because I can track forward and backward. So maybe I'll do this backward first. And it does a pretty good job. Like I might want to go back and try this again. Let's look at the settings. We're going to have this adapt on every feature, and we'll see if that gives us a better track. Marginally. Now, one thing that's important to note is that when After Effects starts tracking, it actually will automatically increase the quality to be the best quality and the highest resolution. If you're working at something that's other than full resolution, as soon as you start tracking, After Effects will actually change that to be full resolution while it's tracking. So it will be looking at the best possible image that you have. And of course, ideally, you're working with footage that is high resolution. If not, it could throw your track off. All right, so we'll track this forward. This looks pretty good. Okay, so we have tracker 2 is done, and this is a 2-point track, and it's including the position, the rotation, and the scale. So we need some place for the tracker to send this information to. So let's make another null object. So we have null 9, and we'll move that underneath null 8. And then we need to tell the tracker that's where we're going to send it to. So we're going to send this to null 9. We'll hit OK, and then we will apply that to null 9. So now we have null 9, and it has rotation, scale, and position. We can see this has a lot more keyframes. If we compare this to 8, I'm going to click the U button so we can look at just those keyframes that are being used. You'll see that there's a lot more information now on null 9 because this is including position, scale, and rotation. And if we twirl down the layer and we look at the trackers, tracker 1 has 1 tracking point and tracker 2 has 2 tracking points. So that's where this information is coming from. So now let's change these 2 layers. So instead of parenting them to null 8, let's parent them to null 9. And let's see what this looks like, if this is very different. Yeah, so clearly this is rotating a little bit and it's scaling as we get closer. And I see that when it starts, it's skewed a little bit. So we might go into that first frame and then rotate these layers a little bit so it matches the pitch of the roof. Now keep in mind, this is not a 3D track. So if you wanted to do a camera track, that's the next thing. And if you wanted to get really detailed in that, then that's when we would use Mocha. This is something where if you want to just put some graphics in there and have them follow along with the footage in kind of a quick way, that's when we would use this 1-point or 2-point track in After Effects. If you need to do a full camera track, then that's when you would use Mocha, or personally, I recommend using Synthize. I think Synthize is going to be the best option for giving you a good camera track. And of course, Synthize is a separate piece of software. That's not an Adobe product. Well, I think with a little bit of fine tuning, we could get this to look a little bit better, but hopefully this is enough to get you started on some motion tracking.